First contact prejudice. The holographic display flickered as senior xenobiologist Zara Tvek slammed her four-fingered hand against the console, her iridescent scales shifting from their usual calm blue to an agitated amber. The transmission from High Command was clear, but she couldn't accept it. "This must be a mistake," she hissed, her secondary respiratory membranes fluttering with indignation. "I am the Federation's leading expert on dangerous species classification. My place is in the laboratory, not on some diplomatic vessel with humans." The face of Admiral Vexkar remained impassive on the screen, his six eyes blinking in sequence, a sign of his growing impatience. "Your expertise is precisely why you've been selected, Scientist Tvek. The Galactic Council has approved humanity's petition for increased cooperation. Your research on their physiology makes you uniquely qualified." "My research confirms they're unpredictable and dangerous," Zora countered, her tail lashing behind her. "They breed without seasonal cycles, Admiral, without proper hormonal regulation or ritual. It's barbaric." "Your prejudice is noted," Vexkar replied coldly. "And irrelevant. Your transport leaves in 6 hours. I suggest you review the diplomatic protocols rather than your personal biases." The transmission ended abruptly. Zara stood frozen, her claws digging into her palms. For 5 cycles, she had built her reputation on classifying humans as a potential threat to the Velikian Federation. Her published works on human reproductive biology had earned her both acclaim and controversy. Humans, with their constant mating drives and lack of proper breeding seasons, represented everything the ordered, cycle-bound Velikian society found disturbing. And now she was being sent to live among them. For 3 full months. Worse still, her own biological cycle was approaching. Every 8 standard months, Velikians entered a brief but intense mating phase, carefully controlled through isolation chambers and pre-selected genetic matches. The timing couldn't be worse for close quarters with humans, creatures who, according to her research, could detect pheromones and might react unpredictably. The diplomatic vessel Harmonious Accord lived up to its name in every way except the actual harmony between its passengers. Zara had boarded with minimal personal items, her scales polished to a diplomatic shine that belied her internal turmoil. The Velician delegation was small, herself, 2 cultural attaches, and a security officer named Krell, whose perpetual scowl matched her own mood. "Senior Scientist Tvek," a human voice called from behind her as she stood in the observation deck, deliberately isolating herself from the welcome reception. "I've been looking forward to meeting you." Zara turned, her crest rising slightly in an instinctive display of caution. The human was tall, even by their standards, with dark skin and sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. His uniform bore the insignia of Earth's United Defense Force. "A commander, then." "I've read all your papers on interspecies biology," he continued when she didn't immediately respond. "Your work on comparative reproductive systems was illuminating." A flush of heat rushed to Zora's scales. Her papers had been explicit in their criticism of human breeding practices. "I stand by my scientific observations, Commander. Harlow. Jack Harlow." He extended a hand, then seemed to remember Velikian customs and smoothly transitioned the gesture into a formal bow instead. "And I didn't say I disagreed with your observations, Doctor. Just that they were missing some cultural context." "Science needs no cultural context," Zora replied stiffly. "Biology is biology." Commander Harlow's mouth quirked in what humans called a smile, a gesture Velikians found inherently threatening due to the display of teeth, though Zara had studied it enough to recognize it as non-aggressive. "If you believe that, Doctor, you might be in the wrong field." Before she could formulate a suitably cutting response, the ship's alert system blared, and both their communication devices activated simultaneously. "All senior personnel to the bridge," came the captain's voice. "We're receiving a distress call." The bridge was a model of efficient chaos as Zara and Commander Harlow arrived. Captain Tulori, a statuesque Velikian female, stood at the center, her scales the deep green of focus and concern. Research Outpost Epsilon 9 has gone silent, she announced without preamble. Their last transmission indicated an unknown pathogen affecting both Velikian and human personnel. Zara's hearts accelerated. Epsilon 9 was a joint biological research station, one of the first collaborative projects between their species. It specialized in studying compatible medical treatments. "We're the nearest vessel with qualified medical personnel," Captain Tulori continued. "Senior Scientist Tvek, Commander Harlow, you'll lead the response team." Zara's crest flattened in alarm. "Captain, with respect, I'm a xenobiologist, not an emergency responder. You've published 3 papers on Velikian human comparative immunology." Commander Harlow interrupted. "That makes you the most qualified person on this ship." She shot him a venomous glare. "And what expertise do you bring, Commander?" "Combat skills for microscopic enemies." His expression hardened. 12 years of field medicine in outbreak zones, Doctor. I was part of the response team during the Martian colony crisis." Captain Tulori's scales rippled with irritation. "If you two are quite finished, there are lives at stake. You have 20 minutes to prepare." Shuttle Bay 3. The research outpost hung in orbit around a small, uninhabited moon, a perfect location for isolation protocols. As their shuttle approached, Zara noted the station's external lights flashing in the universal quarantine pattern. Beside her, Commander Harlow meticulously checked his medical kit, his movements precise and practiced. "I've reviewed your emergency protocols," he said without looking up. "They're incompatible with human physiology in 3 critical areas." Zara bristled. "Our methods have been refined over thousands of years. And they'll kill a human in minutes." He cut in, finally meeting her gaze. "Just as our disinfection procedure would dissolve your protective scales. We need to adapt, or we're useless to everyone in there." The logic was infuriating but undeniable. For the next 10 minutes, they worked in tense silence, modifying their procedures to accommodate both species biology. By the time they docked, they had cobbled together a functional, if inelegant, approach. The station's airlock cycled open to reveal a nightmare. 2 bodies, one Velikian, one human, lay just beyond the entrance. The Velikian's scales had turned a sickly gray, while the human skin showed purple lesions that Zara recognized immediately from her research. "Venom reaction," she muttered, kneeling beside the bodies despite her instinct to maintain distance. "But that's impossible unless both species were exposed to the same toxin," Harlow finished, already scanning the human body with his medical device. "Which shouldn't happen given our different biochemistries." A weak groan echoed from deeper within the station. They exchanged a glance, previous animosity temporarily forgotten in the face of the immediate crisis. Moving as one, they followed the sound to the main laboratory. Dr. Shirka, the Velikian lead researcher, was slumped against a containment unit, her usually brilliant ruby scales dulled to a lifeless maroon. 3 humans lay nearby, unconscious but breathing. "Help them first," Dr. Shirka rasped when she saw Zara. "Humans, react faster." Synthesized. "Trying to bridge the gap." "Bridge what gap?" Zara demanded, administering an emergency stabilizer to the Velikian system, while Harlow moved swiftly to check the humans. "Reproductive. Hormones," Shirka managed before losing consciousness. Zara froze, her gaze snapping to the open containment unit. Inside, a shattered vial leaked a pearlescent fluid that seemed to shimmer under the emergency lights. The label was clear. Project Genesis, interspecies fertility bridge. "They were attempting to create a way for our species to reproduce," she whispered, horror and fascination warring within her. "That's genetically impossible." "Obviously not, or we wouldn't be in this mess," Harlow replied grimly, his focus on stabilizing the human researchers. "The question is whether it was authorized. This goes well beyond the stated research parameters for this station." The implications hit Zora like a physical blow. If someone had authorized secret research into interspecies reproduction, it violated not only scientific ethics, but the Velikians' most sacred biological taboos. The very idea that humans and Velikians could potentially mate went against everything she had taught, everything she believed about the fundamental separation of species. "We need to contain this and get these people treatment," Harlow said, interrupting her thoughts. "Arguments about whether it should have happened can wait until lives aren't at stake." He was right, of course. For the next several hours, they worked side by side, their previous antagonism transformed into efficient partnership by crisis. Harlow's field medicine experience complemented Zora's deep biological knowledge. Together, they stabilized the survivors, decontaminated the laboratory, and secured samples for further analysis. When the emergency response vessel finally arrived, both were exhausted. They sat side by side in the observation room of the Harmonious Accord, watching as the quarantine station grew smaller in the distance. "You surprised me today," Harlow said quietly, breaking the contemplative silence. "Your reputation suggested you be more reluctant to treat humans." Zara's scales shifted to a thoughtful blue-green. "I'm a scientist first, Commander. My personal views don't interfere with my duty." "Don't they?" His gaze was penetrating. "Your papers classify humans as dangerous primarily because we don't conform to Velikian reproductive norms." A flush of heat traveled through Zora's scales, but she met his gaze steadily. "Your species' constant mating drive has led to population crisis, resource wars, and societal structures built around sexual competition. These are observable facts." "Observed through a Velikian lens," he countered. "You see chaos where we see freedom. You see danger where we see potential." The word hung between them. Potential. What she had witnessed today suggested potential she had never considered, never wanted to consider. The possibility that Velikians and humans might be more compatible than anyone had imagined was terrifying. It challenged everything she thought she knew. "This incident will need to be investigated," she said instead of addressing his point directly. "Unauthorized genetic experimentation." "Assuming it was unauthorized," Harlow interjected. "The equipment was too advanced, the research too specific for a rogue operation." Zara's crest rose in alarm. "You think our governments sanctioned this?" "I think," he said carefully, "that there's more to this diplomatic mission than either of us were told." As the stars streamed past the viewport, Zara found herself studying the human beside her, truly seeing him for the first time as an individual rather than a representative of a species she had categorized and dismissed. There was intelligence in his eyes, principle in his actions. During the crisis, he had demonstrated the same calm efficiency her own people valued. Perhaps there was more to learn here than she had anticipated, and perhaps her carefully constructed theories about humans needed serious revision. But that would mean admitting she had been wrong. And as the strange, unwelcome flutter in her secondary heart suggested, it might mean confronting feelings that had no place in scientific classification. Breaking barriers. The diplomatic vessel Harmonious Accord hummed with tension in the days following the Epsilon 9 incident. What had begun as a routine mission of cultural exchange had transformed into something far more complex, an investigation that threatened to unravel years of careful diplomacy between humans and Velikians. Zara Tvek found herself in an unexpected position. Rather than maintaining her careful distance from the humans aboard, she was now working closely with Commander Harlow, analyzing the samples they had retrieved from the research station. Their makeshift laboratory had become both workspace and neutral territory, the one place where species differences seemed to matter less than the puzzle before them. "These genetic markers shouldn't be compatible," she muttered, studying the holographic display of DNA strands floating between them. "The base pairs are fundamentally different." Harlow leaned closer, his presence sending an unwelcome ripple through her scales. "And yet they've been successfully spliced here and here." He pointed to junctions in the display where Velikian and human genetic material had been seamlessly joined. "This isn't theoretical research. They were in the implementation phase." Zara's crest flattened against her head. a sign of deep distress among her people. This violates everything we understand about species boundaries. Reproductive isolation is the very definition of separate species. On Earth, we discovered centuries ago that speciation is more fluid than we thought, Harlow replied, his voice carrying none of the judgment she expected. Boundaries blur. Nature finds ways. This isn't nature, Zara snapped, her scales flashing amber with emotion. This is deliberate manipulation. Harlow's eyes met hers steadily. Is that what troubles you, Doctor? The manipulation, or the possibility that your species and mine might not be as fundamentally separate as you've built your career claiming? Before she could formulate a response, her personal communicator chimed. A priority message from Admiral Vexkar. Zara moved to a private corner of the lab to take the call, her scales prickling with unease. The Admiral's 6 eyes blinked in rapid sequence when his image appeared, a warning sign she recognized immediately. The samples you recovered have been classified, he stated without preamble. You are to turn over all materials and delete your findings. This incident is now under military jurisdiction. Zara's secondary respiratory membranes fluttered in shock. Admiral, with respect, this is a scientific and ethical matter that requires transparent investigation. The genetic manipulation we've discovered is none of your concern, Vexkar cut in sharply. Your role was xenobiology, not policy. Remember your place, Scientist Tvek. When the transmission ended, Zara remained motionless, her mind racing. In 15 years of service to the Federation, she had never questioned orders, had prided herself on her objectivity and compliance with protocol. But this felt wrong on a fundamental level. Bad news. Harlow's voice startled her from her thoughts. She turned to find him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Something in his gaze, concern, perhaps, or understanding, prompted honesty, where she would normally have offered only professionally distant courtesy. They want us to destroy the evidence, she said quietly. Classify everything. Harlow's expression hardened. I received similar orders 10 minutes ago. You did. Zara's crest rose in surprise. Apparently both our governments want this to disappear. He moved closer, lowering his voice. The question is why. If this was unauthorized research, they'd want to prosecute. If it was authorized, then they're hiding something much bigger, Zara finished, the implications settling like ice in her veins. Their eyes met, and in that moment, something shifted between them, suspicion giving way to wary alliance. Whatever was happening went beyond species differences. They were standing at the edge of something momentous, and neither of their governments wanted them looking too closely. We need to secure a copy of this data before we comply, Harlow said, decision evident in his voice. Zara hesitated only briefly before nodding. The harmonious accord will reach the diplomatic hub in 36 hours. If we're going to act, it needs to be before then. They worked through the night cycle, carefully documenting and encrypting their findings while appearing to follow orders. The more they discovered, the more disturbing the picture became. The genetic research at Epsilon 9 hadn't been a recent development. It had been ongoing for nearly 5 years, with tacit approval from both human and Velikian authorities. They've been lying to both our peoples, Zara said, her voice hollow as the evidence mounted. Creating fear and separation in public while pursuing integration in secret. Harlow's expression was grim. Control through manufactured division. It's an old human political tactic. But why? Zara's tail lashed in frustration. What purpose does it serve to keep our species artificially separated if compatibility is possible? Power, Harlow said simply. Those who control access to something valuable hold power over others. If our species can successfully reproduce, but only through technology they control. The implications made Zora's scales crawl. She had spent her career believing the differences between their species were insurmountable, had built her professional reputation on it. And yet, the evidence before her suggested that much of what she knew had been carefully managed propaganda. As the ship's cycle shifted to artificial night, They finalized their security measures and parted ways, each needing rest before what would undoubtedly be a challenging day ahead. Zara returned to her quarters, her mind in turmoil. Sleep proved elusive. Her approaching biological cycle intensified her emotional state, making it impossible to maintain the clinical detachment she usually prided herself on. Images of the day kept intruding. Harlow's steady hands as they worked together, the intensity in his eyes when they realized the scope of the deception, the strange sense of connection that had formed between them through shared discovery. A soft chime at her door startled her from her thoughts. Opening it, she found Harlow standing there, his expression tense. "We've been compromised," he said without preamble. "Security personnel just entered the lab. We need to move now." Instinct took over. Zara grabbed her personal data device and followed him through the dimly lit corridors of the sleeping ship. They moved silently, avoiding the main passages, using service tunnels that Harlow somehow knew intimately. "You've studied the ship's schematics," she observed as they descended into the lower decks. "Always know your terrain," he replied with the ghost of a smile. First rule of survival. They'd reached the shuttle bay undetected. Harlow moved to a communication console and began bypassing security protocols with practiced ease. "What exactly is your plan, Commander?" Zara asked, keeping watch at the entrance. "Transmitting our findings to multiple secure locations," he explained, fingers flying over the controls. "Too many for them to contain." Zara's scales prickled with alarm. "That's treason." He paused, looking up at her with unexpected intensity. "Sometimes loyalty to principles outweighs loyalty to institutions, Doctor. I thought scientists understood that." The words struck deeper than she wanted to admit. What was the purpose of scientific inquiry if not truth? And if her government was deliberately manipulating that truth? Her decision solidified. She moved to join him at the console, adding her own access codes to strengthen the transmission. The scientific community on Valakis Prime needs to see this. They'll understand the implications. They worked in synchrony, each anticipating the other's needs with surprising accuracy. The encrypted data packets were prepared, addresses verified, and then the shuttle bay doors slid open. Admiral Vexkar stood framed in the entrance, flanked by both Valician and human security personnel. His scales were the deep red of command authority, his 6 eyes fixed on Zara with cold disappointment. "Senior Scientist Tivek. Commander Harlow." "Step away from the console." Harlow straightened, positioning himself slightly in front of Zara. "We're performing our duty to truth, Admiral." "You're interfering with matters beyond your clearance," Vexkar replied. "This stops now." Zara moved forward, her scales shifting to the formal blue-gold pattern of diplomatic address. "With respect, Admiral, genetic manipulation of this magnitude can't be hidden forever. Our peoples deserve to know." "Know what?" Vexkar's voice was dangerously soft. "That we're not so different after all. That the barriers we've maintained for generations are more political than biological. Think of the chaos that would cause." "Or the freedom," Harlow countered. "The end of artificial division." Vexkar's secondary eyelids blinked rapidly, a sign of agitation. "Freedom is chaos, Commander. Structure requires boundaries. False boundaries serve only those who draw them," Zara said, finding courage in conviction. "As a scientist, I cannot support deliberate suppression of truth. As your superior, I don't require your support, only your compliance." Vexkar signaled to the security team. "Detain them both." What happened next occurred with such speed that Zara would later struggle to reconstruct the sequence. Harlow moved, a blur of efficiency, disarming the first security officer and using the moment of confusion to slam his palm against the transmission control. The console flashed green. Complete. "Stop them," Vexkar roared, but it was too late. The truth was out, spreading to scientific institutions, media outlets, and public forums across both their worlds. Whatever happened next, the secret was no longer contained. The security team subdued them quickly after that. Zara found herself in a holding cell adjacent to Harlow's, separated by a transparent barrier. For hours, they sat in silence, each processing the magnitude of what they had done. "They'll separate us when we reach the hub," Harlow said finally, his voice carrying through the communication system between cells. "Different legal systems, different consequences." Zara's scales had settled into a calm blue of acceptance. "I regret nothing. The truth needed to be known, even if it contradicts everything you've taught about humans." There was genuine curiosity in his question, not accusation. She considered this carefully. "Science advances through revision of hypothesis, Commander. When evidence contradicts theory, a good scientist adjusts their understanding." A smile crossed his face, one that, strangely, no longer triggered her instinctive aversion to bared teeth. "Jack," he said, "I think we're past titles, Zara." The use of her personal name sent an unexpected warmth through her scales. "Perhaps we are, Jack." Before they could continue, the ship lurched violently, alarms blaring throughout the vessel. The barrier between their cells flickered, then disappeared as emergency protocols engaged. "What's happening?" Zara asked, rising to her feet. Harlow was already at the door, which had unlocked during the power fluctuation. "Nothing good. Stay close." They emerged into chaos. Crew members rushed through corridors, emergency lighting casting everything in pulsing red. Through a viewport, Zora glimpsed the source of the disturbance. A Velikian military vessel had dropped out of faster-than-light travel directly in their path, weapons systems active. "They're trying to stop the information from reaching the hub," Harlow realized aloud. "They'd attack a diplomatic vessel." Zara felt ice in her veins. "If they're willing to go this far, Jack, then what we discovered is even more significant than we thought." They made their way to the bridge, where Captain Tulori stood in rigid defiance, her scales the brilliant white of extreme stress. On the main screen, the face of a Velikian military commander issued threats. "Surrender the traitors and the data, or we will be forced to disable your vessel." "This is a diplomatic ship under protection of the Galactic Accord," Tulori replied, her voice steady despite the danger. "Your actions constitute an act of war. The security of our species supersedes diplomatic niceties," the commander replied coldly. Zara stepped forward, drawing all eyes to her. "Commander Thvol, this aggression is unnecessary. The information has already been transmitted to multiple locations." The commander's scales flashed with rage. "Then you have doomed us all, Scientist Tvek. Do you realize what you've done? Centuries of careful separation, undone by your arrogance." "Truth is not arrogance," she replied, finding strength she hadn't known she possessed. "And what doom comes from acknowledging our compatibility? What disaster from admitting we are not as alien to each other as we've been taught?" A new voice joined the conversation, firm, authoritative, human. Admiral Chen of the Earth Alliance appeared on a split screen, her expression severe. "Stand down, Commander Thvol. Your vessel has been targeted by 3 Earth warships. This diplomatic incident has gone far enough." For tense moments, the outcome hung in balance. Then, slowly, the Velikian military vessel powered down its weapons. "This isn't over," Commander Thvol warned before cutting transmission. In the days that followed, as the Harmonious Accord limped toward the diplomatic hub, the initial shockwaves of their revelation began to ripple through both societies. News reached them in fragments, protests and celebrations, denials and confirmations, scientists stepping forward with corroborating evidence that had been previously suppressed. The political fallout was severe. 3 high-ranking Velikian officials resigned in disgrace. 2 human diplomats were recalled. An emergency session of the Galactic Council was convened to address the revelation that humans and Velikians were not only compatible, but had been deliberately kept apart through propaganda and manufactured cultural taboos. Through it all, Zara and Jack remained in a strange limbo, neither fully prisoners nor fully free. They were kept aboard the Harmonious Accord, awaiting judgment for their actions. They found moments of quiet in the observation deck, watching the stars and processing all that had happened. "What happens now?" Zara asked one evening, her scales a contemplative violet in the dim light. "Officially? Probably a very public slap on the wrist followed by quiet rehabilitation," Jack replied. "They can't make martyrs of us now that the information is public." "And unofficially?" He turned to face her, something in his expression making her secondary heart beat faster. "That depends on us, doesn't it? On whether what happened between us was just circumstance and crisis, or something more." Zara's scales rippled with an emotion she was only beginning to understand. "I've spent my career studying the differences between our species," she said softly. "Perhaps it's time I learned about the similarities." As the ship approached the gleaming diplomatic hub, carrying them toward an uncertain future, Zara realized that her fear of human mating practices had masked a deeper fear, not of difference, but of connection. The barriers between their species had never been as insurmountable as she had believed. The real barriers had been within her own mind, built from prejudice and incomplete understanding. Those barriers were falling now, one by one, as she looked at the human beside her and saw not an alien creature, but a partner in discovery. Whatever came next, judgment, vindication, or something in between, they would face it together, a living embodiment of the truth they had fought to reveal. Sometimes the greatest discoveries came not from looking outward at the stars, but inward at oneself. And sometimes the things we feared most turned out to be the very things we needed to embrace.